Hello, I'm Michael Walsh. I'm the editor of the new book, Against the Corporate Media, 42 Ways the Press Hates You. And with me today is one of our distinguished contributors, Mr. Ashley Rindsberg, who has contributed a piece, one of two, on the sins of the New York Times. And Ashley, as you titled your essay, the Davos Times. So why don't we just jump right in and tell people why it's the Davos Times and what does that portend for journalism in America?
Yeah, I was really trying to understand the question in this essay of the incentives and motivations behind the New York Times. Like, who are they trying to serve? You know, because we often see, and this is something people ask me a lot. In one case, in my book, in The Gray Lady Winked, we have the New York Times sort of running cover for Stalin in the 30s. And then later in the very same decade, they have a Nazi sympathizer running their Berlin bureau. And it seems like there's a big clash there. Is it left or is it right? Which way to, what's going on? And even today, we kind of look and sometimes it's not really clear. Of course, there's a leftward tilt at the paper, but it's still a question of like, how do we understand their motivations? Who is their real power base that they're interested in looking out for? And I think what it is sort of more than the traditional left or right. It's this global power structure that's always existed. It exists in all countries. It's not necessarily spooky. It's just people who are looking out for their own interests, who have banded together to get what they want. So in the question of 1930s, where the Times covered up the Ukraine famine, done through their journalistic implement, Walter Duranty, who gets a lot of the blame, but I think that's actually misassigned. The motivation there was really to pave the way for the United States to recognize the Soviet regime as the official government of Russia. Otherwise, why would you deny something that in Duranty's case he knew had actually happened? Why would any journalist give up the scoop of the decade for a story saying nothing happening here? No journalist wants a story saying nothing happening here, folks. And the reason was that because the New York Times was part of a pretty large group of industrialists, big business from around the country who wanted to open up trade relations with the Soviet Union, which had been disrupted when the Soviets took over power. And they couldn't do that if that same regime had just slaughtered 5 million of its own people through starvation. So they covered it up. And in this case, what happened was Duranty went to a gala at the Waldorf Astoria after recognition had been granted by FDR. It included the heads of railroads, major banks, industry, politicians, and the ambassador from the United States to Russia and vice versa. And only one man at that event got a standing ovation, and that was Walter Duranty. Everybody understood the contribution he had made, and that was to allow this thing to proceed. Why were these people standing and clapping for him? Because it meant that they could now have trade relations with probably at the time the biggest and most rapidly industrializing country in the world, and that was something that they were hungry for. That was just one case where we see the New York Times serving a higher interest that is beyond the traditional left. It wasn't that they were going to bat for labor unions on the left in this case, or something on the right. It was something completely disconnected from traditional left-right politics. And I think this is what the through line is with the Times still today, which is why I called the piece the Davos Times.
Explain the reference to Davos for our viewers, if you would.
Yeah, Davos is the location of the annual World Economic Forum meeting. The World Economic Forum was started by Klaus Schwab. I think you're probably familiar with the story, a protege of Kissinger at Harvard. And I think it was Harvard and John Kenneth Galbraith who were instrumental in getting the WEF off the ground in the, I guess this would have been the late 50s or mid 50s and early 60s, sometime around then. And
It actually goes back further than we think it does, is the point, right?
it goes back decades.
Yeah.
I believe Kissinger was the first keynote at the first WF meeting. But really what it's become today is this, beyond a sort of confab, where it's like this mega convention of global power, where you have massive transnational companies coming together with top-level government leaders from around the world to not only sort of coordinate on policy thinking, but also to announce what's coming up, to broadcast, to advertise the latest in this philosophy of a top-down, centralized meta power that takes place at Davos every year. So,
Conveniently run by a Bond villain, as it turns out.
he's got many of those attributes, yeah.
Yeah, he certainly does. So effectively, it's less of a activist conspiracy than a group of like-minded men, mostly, who have been with us for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. There's certain secret groups or less public groups that have wanted to dictate how the world ought to be administered, I think is what we're talking about.
Yeah, we've seen this trend throughout history. I think that's the point you're alluding to, is we had it through massive power of the church, the Catholic Church at some point, through empires at different points. And there's always been this drive to control as much of the world as a single entity can control on its own. I think this is just something that's part of human nature. What we're seeing today is that it's the latest form is this thing that's technocratic, that's mostly secular, that's sort of benevolent in its posturing, but it obviously is inherently self-interested. And the New York Times slots into that perfectly. The New York Times meets all those characteristics. It is owned by a dynasty that's controlled the newspaper since, or I shouldn't say owned, it's controlled by a dynasty who owns certain voting share
through
class.
advantageous stock categories.
Exactly. Yeah, they have a two-tier stock structure. They own the controlling votes in the stock, and that's been the case since let's say it's for at least a century plus. And they hand power from male heir to male heir.
Yes.
There's never been an exception to that rule. And they're very much a part of the Davos, I won't call it a set, that almost minimizes it, but the Davos superstructure, they're part of that power structure, and they have positioned themselves really brilliantly as this arbiter of truth in the world. I mean, I think this is one of the most canny things they've done over the last 10 years, certainly since Trump's first election when he won the presidency, where they came out with a marketing campaign that was just based around the word truth. The truth matters. So, they have billboards in Times Square and ads across media, which is a really strange thing for a newspaper to say in a way, because you're claiming truth as your own.
Yes.
Where we know that no single entity can have possession of it. It's always going to be distributed, and you're always going to get it wrong. So to claim that whatever goes on in the New York Times is somehow synonymous with truth is part of the problem, because it's denying their error.
It's interesting that in the Bible, Pilate turns to Jesus and says, "What is truth?" And Jesus doesn't have an answer for him. So if even Jesus doesn't know what truth is, what chance does the New York Times actually have in that respect? So it's not so much a conspiracy as it is like-minded individuals pursuing a goal of power and money, effectively.
Yeah.
They just happen to use journalism as the mechanism by which they do it. Is that a fair statement?
I think in the Times case, that's true. But I do think there is an overarching philosophy that we've seen. I think, to your point, it's probably not a conspiracy. I don't think there were 12 men sitting in a room around some table with some symbology deciding. I think it was more emergent. It was more looking at a world where change is happening rapidly, where power structures are crumbling, and That is scary. We can see that every day. It's scary because you're unable to control things that have a destabilizing effect on society. And people observing this, and people in power, and people who also have interests that coincide with these things, reason to themselves that we do need top-down control. Free markets are good because free markets are essential to these people's businesses and their identities. Keep the free markets. But in parallel to free markets, we need a different kind of top-down control. And it's kind of almost, if you abstract what's happened in China, where you have heavy top-down control with a free market. I mean, I won't call it free market, but sort of a quasi-free market.
Right. In a sort of fascistic sense, so collaboration between business and
government. Exactly. So I think it's something analogous to that model with a bit more emphasis on free in the free market, and a little bit less of the despotism in the top-downness. I think it's the top-down mechanism is a control through values that are instilled into a society or infused into society. That it's done primarily first through the media. So the media is the megaphone for these values that we're all supposed to subscribe to. And if we don't, then we are bad, we are Luddites, or we are ignorant, or we are deplorables, or we are spreading disinformation or misinformation. And from there, it sort of seeps into the brands and into pop culture. But the media is really upstream of everything. And the New York Times is upstream of most of the media.
It's, in a way, it's kind of a consensus building, isn't it? The consensus of right think.
Yeah.
That no true Scotsman, XXX, in this case, no true American or no true freedom lover could possibly disagree with any of the principles we articulate every day in the news columns. Now, the New York Times has moved from editorial opinion advocacy to advocacy in every conceivable story now. So they will, where once they would say the president yesterday said blah, blah, today they will say the president yesterday falsely asserted blah, blah, blah. Correct. So they become the judge of the statement even as they're recording the statement.
Right.
This can't be a good thing, can it?
I don't think it is. I mean, I think this is where we're seeing the New York Times, again, taking possession of truth. Not taking responsibility for it, which is different, but taking possession to say, we're going to determine what is considered false or true. And part of that, and again, this was a lot of it was a reaction to Trump. It was sort of abandoning deliberately the concept of objectivity in the news. And this was something that they sort of fused it with concepts from the anti-racism and BLM movement, where they began to create this equivalence between objectivity as a concept in news and white supremacy.
Yes.
So which was one node of this effort. Another one being that Trump was an exceptionally destabilizing figure, and in order to save America, in order to save democracy in our society, journalists are going to have to now, take off the gloves. So Batman never kills the villain, but in this case, he's going to actually have to make that exception and kill the villain. And the New York Times is going to say we're going to have to break the glass, pull the emergency handle, and that emergency handle was outright partisan advocacy for the position they believe to be the right one.
Yeah, they articulated that. Jim Rutenberg did in his famous column, saying Trump is sui generis. We've never had anything like this, and therefore all the old rules are now null and void, effectively.
Exactly. Yes.
The question would be, where do you stop? Do you end that with Trump and then say, okay, everything's fine again, or do you just now make everything Trump that you disagree with? And isn't that one of the dangers of this abandonment of, however chimerical, objectivity was something worth striving for? Yeah.
It was aspirational. It gave you something to work towards. And a friend of mine tells me a story when she used to work at the Times quite a long time ago, let's say 25, 30 years ago. And there was an editor there who refused to vote because he was so concerned that expressing or taking any kind of political action would taint his objectivity and neutrality as a journalist. He put his role as a journalist who ought to be objective and neutral above his own political agency in the country.
Yes.
So that kind of thing, I think, that is the aspiration that we should look towards, but it has been completely trashed.
That is not unusual, by the way. I grew up in the Marine Corps, and I once asked my mother, who did you vote for? And she said, we never voted because Marine officers don't vote. Their allegiance is to the commander-in-chief, whoever that may be. Right. And to have the elite officer corps of the elite fighting force partisan was considered a threat to the Republic.
That's amazing.
I don't believe that's true anymore. I think Marines vote like everybody else does. But there was that feeling that you had to sort of annul your own political agency in order to do the higher calling job that you have.
Yeah, these were safeguards. These were institutional safeguards around the democracy, around the core mechanisms of democracy. And what has happened, especially, of course, with the media, is they have used their power in order to advance an agenda that benefits them or that's in their own ideological interest. And I think there's a bit of a difference there. I think in the one case, we hear a lot about the newsroom, rumblings in the newsroom. And, someone mentioned at the event you hosted last night that James Bennett was tossed out because it was his underlings in the newsroom, which may be true. But beyond that, we also have and not even the masthead, it's the controlling ownership, the Sulzbergers who control the newspaper, who have a whole raft of interests that are really non-ideological. The Times has really infamously fought tooth and nail for the last, I would say, at least 70 years against any kind of unionization within its own paper. And they still do it to this day. So for them, it's still about fighting for interests. For the newsroom, I think it's more and more fighting for ideology. It's a group of people who knew nothing else beyond being partisan. They have no notion of any kind of civic responsibility or participation beyond partisanship.
Yeah, it strikes me as I've watched this develop I started in journalism in 1972. Our politics has become like sports teams who hate each other. It's like the rivalry between the Red Sox and the Yankees, or Ohio State and Michigan. Yeah. It's just, you're born into it.
Yes.
And that's all that matters, is the rivalry. There doesn't seem to be any end beyond that. Even if you win the World Series or you win the Super Bowl, you start all over again the next year. And your allegiance hasn't changed. You don't suddenly abandon the Red Sox because they won a World Series finally. So this doesn't seem to me to be a healthy political system when it's purely tribal rooting and has no larger significance than that.
Yeah, and we're seeing that playing out today, where we're seeing the erosion, for example, of the credibility of the judiciary, because on the one hand, it's being used as a tool for political vengeance, and on the other hand, it's being attacked in the Supreme Court because the rulings have been handed down that offended the left. So the instant reaction is not to say, okay, maybe this is something to consider as an opinion. It's to say the Supreme Court has been corrupted beyond repair, and we have to almost disregard. I think AOC at some point came out to say disregarded. Even Biden said something along the lines of he'll do, I think it had to do with the student loan forgiveness. He'll do it anyway.
Anyway, yeah.
Which is shocking. And if you don't have the media there to be shocked, to express that shock on the behalf of the country, then another one of those guardrails or safeguards falls, and there's nothing behind it to catch it. And here we have a domino effect, and that's what's really worrying, is that it cascades.
How do we restore the guardrails to journalism? How do we polarize the young reporters? Because Bennett was in fact a victim of a newsroom coup from the bottom up, not from the top down. And we've seen that in in other journalistic organizations, or even something non-journalistic like Netflix, where over an LGBTQB whatever issue, they were demonstrating against their employer. Now, at that point, Netflix said, maybe Netflix isn't right for you if you can't follow the corporate line. But a lot of companies just fold in the face of that pressure, don't they?
Yeah. Well, the Times had the same thing. They had a revolt by LGBTQ staffers because they felt that the Times was covering trans issues unfairly, and there was a revolt. And again, you have this another case where the newsroom is crippled, and another case. And what starts to happen is that you realize the employees are running the place at their own whim. It becomes this kind of tyranny of small groups of people. It's probably actually a very small minority who do this stuff, but they realize they understand the tactics, that they can pull it off whenever they want to. You know, there's a great example in the world of tech with Coinbase, where at some point the CEO, after there was a lot, you start to have Slack channels and emails being clogged with political discourse, and you said this and you said that. And he came out and made an announcement and said, we are here to do this work. The work is the mission of making Coinbase successful. And anyone who doesn't want to subscribe to that mission and that mission alone is welcome to leave. We'll help you. There's no animosity, there's no bitterness, but this is not the place for you. And that was considered a groundbreaking move because he did it. I think it was maybe in 2021. It was pretty early, maybe 2022. And it worked. It cleared out this sort of activist class within the company that really didn't belong there. And it probably helped the productivity as well, as my guess. So if there is a publisher or a news organization willing to take a stand, I think they can do it. I just don't know that there's anyone willing to take a stand.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because you have a generation in the workforce that considers that their job is not the job, it's the activism. So it doesn't matter what the company is making, their job is to push whatever the current narrative thing is.
Right.
And so when an employer stands up to them and says, then maybe you're not in the right, if you don't want to make widgets, then this is a widget factory. So, but do we see any evidence that is actually happening besides the one you just expressed? The Times rolled over, obviously, with the Tom Cotton editorial. And
the Times rolled over. They have started to push back. They've started to understand under Joe Kahn, the new executive editor. I think there's been a change of tone there because they understand they can't constantly be crippled by newsroom rebellion and revolt.
At random.
Yeah, at random, exactly.
Basically,
on issues that the Times is probably sympathetic to and works hard to advance even.
Yes.
So whether or not that's going to happen in the media, I don't know. I think probably not. I think what will happen is it'll moderate a bit. It'll moderate a bit so that you can't have a walkout anytime somebody publishes something that someone else doesn't like. The thing I find really funny about the James Bennett thing, which I wrote about in my book, is that it was only weeks or maybe a few months at the most.
And that, for our listeners, that's a book called The Gray Lady Winked. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes. The Gray Lady Winked, yes. Yeah. Just a few weeks or months before the Tom Cotton op-ed, which James Bennett solicited. It wasn't pitched to him. He solicited it. The Times published an op-ed by a very senior figure in the Taliban. And this was an op-ed making these beautiful brotherly promises of, we're going to have an open society, we're going to protect the rights of women, we are going to respect, diversity, like the kinds of things that would appeal, buzzwords that would appeal to New York Times readers. They published it, and this guy wasn't just a Taliban leader; he was also a terror kingpin.
Suburban wine bombs in Westchester County.
Yeah, exactly. What someone's called the PE wives, the private equity wives.
Yes,
but. That went a long way. This is the New York Times legitimizing the view of a very senior Taliban terrorist.
Murderer, yes.
Absolutely. And there was not a peep. There was not a peep from anybody.
Yeah.
There was not, forget the newsroom, there was not a peep from the broader culture to say, you can't just do that. You can't, if it were a neo-Nazi, if it were the grand wizard of the KKK making promises to moderate and respect the opinions of all people and diversity. Would that have been okay with anybody? No, but they could do this because, again, it sort of gels with their ideological line. So back to the question of how things are going to proceed in the culture, I think there will be some moderation. We saw with Google where there was a pro-Palestine demonstration within Google's offices. They were blocking offices so people couldn't enter. They were summarily fired. I think it was a group of about 30. And that's Google, which is, of all big tech, probably the wokest of the bunch.
Yeah.
But there's a point where they're starting to understand, especially in the era we're in now, where money is tight. When money was loose and the stock prices were just going up and up and up, that's one thing. But now where you're struggling to make sure you're hitting your quarterly projections, you can't have a bunch of people, 10, 15, 20 people disrupt a company's operations. It's just not going to fly.
Yeah.
So this kind of tightening of the money supply in a weird way, I think will also have an effect on the culture.
So in other words, self-interest may in fact come back into play here.
Exactly.
Rather than with the example of the Taliban, we want this to be true, therefore it is true. I mean, that is one of the characteristics of Times world in the first place. One last question. Does the Times emerge from this shakeout as the only newspaper left in the United States? What can compete against it?
I think they are, I think that's the strategy that they're aiming for. They're aiming to not just be number one, but the only one.
Yes, exclusivity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bezos is backing the Washington Post, of course. If he continues to be willing to not only front the money is probably not the main issue for him. It's probably just the headache, the dealing with the hubbub, dealing with the controversies, the rolling crises. If he's willing to continue to do that, I think there's some competition from the Washington Post, from a few certain other outlets. But in terms of, let's say, print media, which is obviously not the physical print, but text-based media, not video media, I think the Times is probably going to be absolutely the market leader in the news category.
Yeah.
I can't see anyone challenging it.
Well, this is where their business model will help them. And because, first of all, they've been in this business forever. So they're not like Bezos who's going to say, what do you mean the newsrooms? And, all these things that happen in daily journalism. And also because of their primogenitor lines of succession, they're in a way a really kind of primitive tribe that says it's the hetman's son will continue to rule indefinitely.
Yeah.
And it gives them a stability that the Grahams didn't have at the Washington Post. So
yeah, that's right. The dynasty has a stabilizing effect, and there's a culture, an internal culture within the controlling class at the Times that's very hard to dislodge. So you can't have these kind of wild zigzagging turns within the strategy, the culture, the business model. It's all fairly determined, and almost like the monarchy we're sitting in Westminster, the British monarchy has persisted because there is that kind of chain of custody where you're passing down authority from generation to generation in a very controlled manner.
Ashley Rindsberg, thank you very much for your contribution to our book.
Thank you, Michael.
We'll look forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks so much.